At a glittering corporate party, a wealthy CEO mocked her janitor in front of everyone, daring him with a cruel laugh. "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you." The crowd roared, expecting humiliation, but the janitor only smiled and whispered, "Careful what you promise." None of them knew the truth, that this so-called janitor carried a secret past as a decorated pilot, a broken hero with scars deeper than wealth could ever measure. When tragedy struck on the rooftop, the moment came for him to rise, and what he revealed would leave the CEO and everyone watching absolutely speechless. Stay with me till the end, because this is not the story you think it is. Now let's dive in. The ballroom of Sinclair Tower shimmered beneath grand chandeliers, each crystal reflecting the wealth and power of those gathered beneath them. Laughter, sharp and hollow, rose above the clinking of champagne glasses, a sound that filled the air with arrogance more than joy. The city's most powerful executives strutted like peacocks, their polished shoes tapping across the flawless marble floor that gleamed as though alive. In the midst of this splendor moved Ethan, the janitor, dressed in a faded uniform that seemed out of place in such a setting. His mop glided across the marble with steady rhythm, his movements quiet, almost reverent, as if the floor itself mattered more to him than the people who walked upon it. He kept his eyes lowered, not from fear, but from the habit of a man who had grown used to being unseen. The laughter of the wealthy swelled, occasionally broken by the popping of champagne corks, the shallow conversations about profits and acquisitions, the endless chorus of pride. But through it all, Ethan worked silently, a ghost among the living, present but never acknowledged. Yet Isabella Sinclair, the CEO, noticed him. She always noticed him. Draped in a flowing gown of midnight silk, she stood like a queen surveying her kingdom, her every gesture polished, her smile razor-sharp. Her eyes, cold and calculating, drifted across the room until they landed on Ethan. Something in the way he paused, just for a second, caught her attention. His gaze had lifted, not toward her, but toward the rooftop helipad visible through the tall glass windows. For the briefest moment, his expression shifted, not of longing but of memory, as if the sight of that machine resting above the tower stirred something buried deep inside him. Isabella's lips curved with cruel amusement. She leaned closer to her circle of elite guests, her voice carrying easily across the laughter. "Fly this helicopter, janitor," she mocked, her tone dripping with disdain, "and I'll marry you." Her words sliced through the chatter like a blade, drawing every eye toward Ethan. A ripple of laughter followed, cruel and sharp, echoing across the golden hall. Champagne nearly spilled from crystal flutes as executives chuckled at the absurdity of her challenge. Most expected Ethan to flinch, to bow his head and hurry away in humiliation, just as so many would. But he didn't. His mop stilled, his hands resting calmly on its handle, and for the first time that night, he lifted his gaze. The crowd quieted, their laughter faltering as they saw his eyes. There was no embarrassment in them, no shame. Instead, there was a storm, a depth of pain and power hidden behind their calm surface. His lips tugged into the faintest of smiles, not mocking, not forced, but unsettling in its confidence. He bowed his head slightly, his voice steady, low, but strong enough to cut through the heavy silence. "Careful what you promise." The words seemed to linger in the air long after they were spoken, hanging like smoke in the glittering ballroom. The laughter died entirely now, replaced by a thin, uneasy quiet. So, meething about his tone unsettled them, though they could not place why. Isabella arched an eyebrow, feigning amusement, though her chest tightened unexpectedly. She waved her hand dismissively, forcing another laugh from her lips, and the crowd quickly followed her lead, desperate to return to their arrogance. Yet beneath the surface, unease rippled. A single janitor had shifted the entire mood of the room with nothing more than a glance and a sentence. Isabella told herself it was nothing, just a lucky moment that startled her. But somewhere deep within her, a seed of curiosity, unwanted and dangerous, had been planted. Ethan lowered his gaze again, returning to his mop as though nothing had happened, his silence louder than all the music and chatter around him. But Isabella could not tear her eyes away. She told herself she had made a joke, that it was harmless, yet she felt as though she had just knocked on a locked door without knowing what waited behind it. The crowd moved on, conversations resuming, the music swelling once again, but Isabella's thoughts lingered uneasily on the janitor who did not break. And in the shadows of his calm, Ethan's faint smile remained, carrying secrets no one in that glittering room could imagine. Secrets that, once awakened, would change. everything. The party had long ended, but Ethan's faint smile lingered in Isabella's thoughts like an echo she could not silence. For Ethan, though, the night continued in silence as he stepped out of the glittering tower and into the cold embrace of the city streets. The noise of luxury cars departing faded quickly behind him, replaced by the hum of distant traffic and the whisper of the wind that threaded through dim alleys. He carried no champagne, no victories from the night, only the weight of memory pressing against his shoulders. His walk was unhurried, yet every step felt deliberate, as if leading him into the past rather than toward home. When he arrived at his apartment, the building greeted him with peeling paint and rusted railings, a stark contrast to the crystal halls he had just left behind. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete and dust, but Ethan moved without hesitation, unlocking the chipped wooden door that creaked open with familiarity. Inside, the small space was dim, illuminated only by the glow of a single lamp and the soft hum of the old refrigerator. Silence wrapped itself around the room like an old companion, heavy, patient, unrelenting. The walls told stories that no one else could hear. Medals, dulled by years of neglect, hung in crooked frames. Certificates, once celebrated, now yellowed at the edges, were pinned to the wall like forgotten relics. Faded photographs leaned against each other on a cluttered shelf, their smiles frozen in time. Ethan's eyes lingered on one in particular, the photograph of a younger man, himself, standing in uniform, crisp and proud. Beside him towered the sleek body of a helicopter, the machine gleaming in the sunlight, the background filled with comrades whose laughter had once been his world. His smile in that photograph was wide, unburdened, alive with purpose. But purpose had turned to ash. That same helicopter, the very symbol of his pride, had carried him into the sky on the day everything shattered. A mission gone wrong, a mechanical failure, a moment where life split into before and after. He remembered the sound, the scream of twisting metal, the violent lurch of the aircraft, the earth rushing up with merciless speed. He remembered crawling from the wreckage, broken, breathless, his uniform torn, his hands slick with blood. And he remembered the absence that followed, the one voice he longed for, silenced forever, his wife. Her name rose in his mind like a prayer and a curse. She had not died in that crash, no. Fate had reserved a crueler punishment. He had survived only to watch her fade away months later, her body surrendering to an illness that might have been stopped. He had begged, pleaded with the hospital for help, only to hear the cold denial. The surgery was too costly, the insurance insufficient, the system merciless, and the hospital belonged to the very empire now ruled by Isabella Sinclair. The memory tightened his chest as though a hand gripped his heart. He could still see his wife's frail fingers clutching his, her whisper of reassurance as her breath grew weaker. He had sworn to her then that he would endure for their daughter, that he would not crumble even as his world turned hollow. And so he had buried the pilot, buried the hero, buried the man who once commanded the skies. In his place remained only Ethan the janitor, sweeping floors in the tower of the empire that had written his wife's death sentence. In the corner of the apartment, a small voice stirred in the quiet. "Daddy?" It was Lily, his daughter, her hair tousled from sleep, her little feet padding across the worn carpet. She clutched a stuffed bear, its seams fraying, its button eye loose, but her smile was soft, innocent. Ethan knelt, scooping her into his arms, his calloused hands gentler than the world had ever been with him. Her presence was his anchor, the only reason he endured the humiliation of polishing floors for people who laughed at his scars. He tucked her back into bed, smoothing the blanket over her shoulders. She drifted back into dreams, unaware of the storm that raged inside her father. Ethan stood by her side, watching her chest rise and fall, his jaw clenched against the weight of memories that threatened to crush him. When he finally returned to the living room, his gaze settled once more on Isabella's mocking smile replaying in his mind. He could still hear her voice, sharp and cruel, cutting into him in that glittering ballroom. Her words had been meant as a joke, but they had pierced through the years, striking the very wound he had fought so hard to conceal. His fists clenched, veins rising beneath his skin, the fire of grief and rage burning through the mask of calm he wore in public. Yet even as anger consumed him, there was something else rising alongside it. An awakening. He had long tried to bury the man he once was, but Isabella's taunt had shaken the earth beneath that grave. Something stirred in the shadows of his past, something restless, something alive. And as the night deepened outside his window, the faint hum of a distant helicopter cut through the silence, pulling his gaze upward. His reflection in the glass was no longer just a janitor's. It was the ghost of a pilot staring back at him. What Isabella had thought was mockery had instead reopened a wound that had never healed, a wound that could not stay buried forever. The sound of rotor blades in the distance seemed almost like a summons, a whisper from the sky reminding him of what he once was. And deep within Ethan's chest, the storm he had suppressed for years finally began to stir. Morning light filtered through Ethan's window, but it felt heavier than most days, carrying with it the echo of rotor blades that had haunted him through the night. He dressed in his janitor's uniform with quiet resolve, slipping back into the mask of invisibility he wore each day. Yet as he walked toward Sinclair Tower, there was a pulse in his chest that hadn't been there in years. A restless thrum like a machine long dormant beginning to stir again. The city was alive with its usual noise, but within him the silence of memory pressed louder. At the tower, business carried on as usual. Executives in tailored suits hurried through the glass doors, assistants tapped at phones, security stood stiff by the elevators. For Ethan, the day began like any other. His mop, his bucket, the endless marble floors that reflected everyone but him. Yet beneath the routine, a shift was waiting, a storm building above their heads. By noon, the rooftop helipad roared to life, blades cutting through the air as a partner's helicopter descended. WW. Hat should have been routine quickly unraveled. The machine jerked violently, its nose dipping, blades screaming louder than they should, the whir turning erratic, dangerous, the air filled with a metallic thunder as panic surged through those watching. Executives spilled onto the rooftop, their voices frantic, their polished composure evaporating as the aircraft bucked like a wild beast. Documents flew from open briefcases, whipping into the wind, scattering across the concrete. Men and women who once commanded boardrooms now stumbled and shouted, scrambling toward the exit. Isabella Sinclair stood at the front, her hair whipping across her face, her gown pressed by the violent gust. Her expression, usually composed and proud, cracked under the weight of raw fear. The helicopter tilted dangerously, one skid slamming against the pad with a screech, sparks leaping from the metal. The pilot inside pulled desperately at the controls, sweat pouring down his temples, his mouth moving in silent curses. The aircraft shuddered, threatening to tip and send itself and everyone nearby into fiery ruin. Amid the chaos, a figure moved against the current of fear. Ethan pushed through the scattering crowd, his uniform flaring in the gusts of the blades, his steps firm where others faltered. His eyes were locked on the machine, not with terror, but with recognition. The sound that drove others to panic steadied him, pulling him back to the skies he once commanded. "Move!" his voice thundered, cutting through the storm of noise. It was not a plea, not a suggestion. It was an order, a command from someone who had once spoken through headsets with lives hanging on every word. The people around him froze, something in his tone bypassing their disbelief, making their bodies obey before their minds understood why. The pilot, trembling, glanced at Ethan, his hands slipping uselessly against the controls. For a second, disbelief flickered, but then instinct told him the truth. This man knew. Without argument, he released the controls, stumbling back, surrendering the cockpit. To the stranger in janitor's clothes. Ethan climbed in, his movements fluid, practiced, as if no years had passed since his hands last touched such a machine. His palms gripped the cyclic and collective, the vibrations surging up his arms like an old friend reawakening. The smell of fuel, the scream of blades, the trembling body of the helicopter. It was chaos to everyone else, but to him, it was home. He breathed once, deeply, and then acted. His hands moved with precision, steadying the pitch, easing the throttle, correcting the angle of descent. The wild bucking began to settle, the machine responding not to brute force, but to his calm authority. Slowly, carefully, he guided it down, pulling against its resistance with nerves of steel honed long before the world had forgotten his name. The skids struck the pad with a harsh bounce, but he held it steady, coaxing it down with the finesse of a master. Inch by inch, the chaos surrendered, until finally, with a final screech, the helicopter rested flat upon the rooftop. The blades still spun furiously, but the danger had passed. The beast was tamed. Silence followed, heavy, stunned, broken only by the dull hum of the engine winding down. The crowd who had mocked him just hours before now stared in disbelief, their mouths open, their eyes wide. Not a janitor, not a shadow. For a moment they saw him for who he was. Isabella's breath caught. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he stepped down from the cockpit, the wind tugging at his hair, his gaze steady, unreadable. She felt the ground shift beneath her pride. Her words from the night before echoed inside her head with mocking clarity. "Fly this helicopter, janitor, and I'll marry you." But what stunned her wasn't just that he had done it. It was how he had done it. With authority, with composure, with skill that no ordinary man could possess. The janitor she thought invisible had just saved them all. The crowd parted instinctively as Ethan walked forward, their silence louder than applause, their stares clinging to him as though searching for answers he would not give. His uniform marked him as a man beneath them, yet his presence towered above them all. Isabella's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, her voice failed her. And as Ethan's eyes briefly met hers, a storm passed between them, a silent promise that what she thought she knew of him was only the beginning. The rooftop still trembled from the near disaster, but the true quake had already begun, inside Isabella, inside the crowd, and inside the man who had just revealed that his past was far greater than the role he now played. And for the first time, Isabella wondered if she had awakened something she could no longer control. The rooftop air was still heavy with the scent of fuel and the echo of rotor blades, but the true silence came from the people standing frozen, unable to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Their polished shoes scuffed nervously against the helipad, their eyes darting between the man in the janitor's uniform and the helicopter that still trembled faintly from its violent landing. Ethan stood in the center of it all, his chest rising with calm control, his expression unshaken despite the chaos he had just mastered. Isabella Sinclair's lips parted, her throat dry as if the wind had stolen her voice. Pride, once her armor, now felt like a weight crushing her ribs. She had built her entire empire on the illusion of being untouchable, of never faltering, of always standing above those beneath her. And yet, in the span of mere minutes, a janitor had stripped her of that illusion without saying a word. Her breath faltered as she looked at him, wind-swept hair, strong shoulders, eyes that carried storms. Who are you?" The words tumbled out of her almost involuntarily, trembling between disbelief and awe. She did not speak as a CEO then, nor as a queen of wealth, but as a wooer, and confronted by something she could not name. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady, unblinking. His voice came low, cold and cutting, stripped of pride yet brimming with truth. "A janitor, just like you said." The simplicity of the answer struck harder than any boast could have. He denied her no satisfaction, offered no revelation, only the truth wrapped in quiet defiance. And that truth sank into her like ice, for it carried a message far greater than the words themselves, that she had mocked a man whose dignity could not be stolen by her cruelty. Before she could form a reply, a sudden sound broke through the stunned silence, the rapid patter of small footsteps. A little girl ran onto the rooftop, her dark hair whipping around her face, her small arms clutching something tight against her chest. It was Lily, Ethan's daughter, her innocence a stark contrast to the cold arrogance of the gathered executives. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice cutting through the air like a bell. Her tiny feet barely stopped before she threw herself into his arms, her joy untainted by the fear that had gripped everyone else. In her hands she clutched a photograph, edges worn, corners bent from too much love. She held it up proudly, her eyes wide with wonder. "Daddy, you did it again," she said with a giggle of pure pride. "Just like when Mummy used to clap for you." The words struck the rooftop harder than the helicopter's skids had. The laughter that once mocked Ethan now vanished into uneasy silence. Isabella froze where she stood, her pulse racing, as the photograph slipped from Lily's small fingers and fluttered into Isabella's hand. Her eyes dropped to the image, and her world shifted. Ethan stood tall in crisp military uniform, a figure of strength beside the gleaming body of a helicopter, and next to him, with a smile radiant and tender, stood a woman, his wife, long gone, but immortal certes. In that captured moment of pride, the picture burned in Isabella's hand, heavier than any contract, more damning than any signature. Gasps rippled through the rooftop as others caught sight of the photograph as the whispers began to spread like wildfire. Executives, staff, and partners who had laughed at the janitor now saw the truth carved into paper and flesh. This man was no servant. He was a broken hero, stripped of his wings not by failure, but by tragedy. Isabella's stomach twisted. Her pride, her shield, shattered into fragments she could not piece back together. For the first time in years, shame coursed through her. Not the mild sting of a mistake in business, but the deep human shame of realizing she had trampled on another's dignity without ever seeing the soul beneath. Her fingers trembled as she held the photo, her reflection staring back faintly in the glass of its frame. She wanted to speak, to explain, to undo the careless cruelty of her words, but the weight of her arrogance pressed too heavily against her chest. Her empire, her power, her wealth, none of it shielded her from the truth now glaring into her eyes. Ethan stood still, Lily clinging to his hand, his silence deafening. He did not gloat, did not boast, did not ask for recognition. That silence was worse than fury. It left Isabella to drown in her own conscience. The executives shifted uncomfortably, no longer laughing, no longer sneering. Their eyes avoided hers, for they too had mocked him, and now they bore the same guilt mirrored in her face. The city stretched endlessly beyond the rooftop, but for Isabella, the world had narrowed to this single moment. A man she had dismissed as nothing revealed himself as everything she could never buy. Strength, resilience, sacrifice, and honor. Her voice quivered as she tried to find words, but none came. All she could do was look at Ethan, his jaw set, his eyes carrying both fire and sorrow. In those eyes, she saw a truth she could not deny. She had awakened something far more dangerous than a memory. She had awakened a man who had once conners, queered the skies and carried love in his heart. And though life had broken him, it had not destroyed him. And as the rooftop held its breath, Isabella felt a flicker of fear. Not of Ethan's past, but of what that past meant for her future. For the first time in her reign as CEO, Isabella Sinclair felt powerless, standing not above a janitor, but beneath the shadow of a man whose dignity no power on earth could erase. And in that shadow, her pride was not only broken, it was dangerously close to transforming into something else she could not yet name. The rooftop silence of that night lingered in Isabella's mind for days, an echo she could not escape no matter how many contracts she signed or meetings she led. Numbers, profits, and power blurred into meaninglessness, replaced by the haunting image of a man in a janitor's uniform standing taller than any CEO. She had looked into his eyes and seen storms, pain, and dignity that no empire could buy. That memory carved itself into her like stone, unshakable and unyielding. Every evening, when the city lights glimmered outside her penthouse windows, Isabella found herself staring at the reflection of her own face, polished, flawless, yet strangely hollow. Behind her eyes flickered the sight of Lily running into her father's arms, her small voice ringing with joy, her innocence cutting deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever could. Isabella had never known such purity, such truth, and it gnawed at her pride until she could no longer ignore it. Finally, one night, when the city's towers gleamed like shards of glass against the dark, Isabella did what she had never done before. She left her world of silk and steel behind. Her sleek car rolled through narrow streets, far from the glittering skyline, until she stopped before a modest building, its walls tired and weathered but alive with warmth. For the first time in years, she felt nervous, her hand pausing on the door before she knocked. Inside, Ethan sat at a small wooden table, the glow of a dim lamp spilling across his hands. He was repairing Lily's school project, carefully reattaching tiny paper wings to a cardboard airplane. His expression was focused, patient, gentle, so unlike the man she had mocked, yet perfectly aligned with the hero she had seen. Lily sat beside him, her chin resting on the table, her eyes bright with admiration for her father. When the door creaked, Ethan looked up. His gaze met Isabella's, not with anger, but with guarded silence. His eyes carried shadows still, scars that words could never erase. Isabella stepped inside, her heels sounding strangely loud on the worn floor. For the first time, she did not feel like a CEO. She felt like a woman standing before a truth far greater than her own pride. "I mocked you," she whispered, her voice trembling, fragile as glass. Her throat tightened as her eyes flickered between him and the little girl. "But you've taught me more than power ever could. I saw strength in you, strength I never understood until now." Ethan did not answer. His silence lingered, heavy, like the weight of skies he once commanded. He lowered his gaze back to the project, his hands steady, but his heart locked behind walls only time and truth could breach. The quiet stretched, a canyon between them filled with words unspoken. Then a small hand reached across that canyon. Lily tugged gently at Isabella's fingers, her eyes full of innocence untainted by power or shame. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked, her voice sweet, her smile brighter than the dull light of the lamp. The question cut through everything: Isabella's pride, Ethan's silence, the heaviness of the past. For a moment the air softened. Isabella's lips parted, a laugh escaping her, fragile but real. She knelt beside Lily, her silk dress brushing against the worn floor, and nodded. "Yes, I'll stay." That night, the tiny apartment transformed. The clinking of mismatched plates, the laughter of a child, the aroma of simple food. It was a world Isabella had never known. Wealth had given her everything, yet left her with nothing as warm as this. She listened to Lily's stories, to the sound of Ethan's voice softening when he spoke to his daughter, to the quiet music of a home stitched together by love and survival. For the first time in years, Isabella laughed. Not the sharp, hollow laugh of power, but the kind that healed something broken inside. And in Ethan's steady silence, she saw not just pain, but resilience, a strength born of loss, yet unbent by it. Her mind replayed the words she had once flung like daggers. "Fly this helicopter, Janitor, and I'll marry you." They had been born of mockery, but now they echoed with haunting truth. He had done it. Flown not just a machine, but risen above the weight of scorn, despair, and loss. He had proven himself not for her, not for the crowd, but for the daughter whose eyes carried both his past and his future. As she watched him tuck Lily into bed, Isabella realized something that made her chest ache. Ethan did not need saving. He never had. It was she, with all her wealth and power, who had been lost, blind, drowning in pride. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was the one who needed him to pull her back into the sky. When the night ended and she stepped out into the cool air, Isabella looked back at the small apartment. It wasn't grand. It wasn't rich. But it was alive, beating with love stronger than steel towers. And for the first time, she wished to belong to something she could not own, but only earn. The promise she once mocked had been rewritten, not by contracts or laughter, but by truth, humility, and the fragile thread of hope that tied them all together. And so their story lingered in the night sky, unfinished yet eternal, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories are born not in wealth, but in the ashes of broken pride. Thank you for staying with this tale till the very end. If Ethan's journey and Isabella's awakening touched your heart, please subscribe to Heartwoven Tales and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your feelings. Stay with us for the next story, where another heart will speak, another soul will rise, and another promise will be rewritten in ways you won't forget.